The Spencer estate had always been a monument to power, legacy, and carefully maintained illusion. Its glass walls reflected the Pacific in long, shimmering streaks, as if the ocean itself had agreed to play along with the myth of perfection that surrounded the Spencer name. But on that night, beneath chandeliers that cast a brittle, artificial glow over marble floors, perfection fractured beyond repair. The air inside the mansion felt thick, almost metallic, as though it had absorbed too many unsaid accusations. What began as a confrontation over grief and blame would soon become something far more devastating. A revelation that transformed sorrow into horror, and love into betrayal. Will stood near the grand staircase, shoulders rigid, his face pale with exhaustion. Luna's death had already hollowed him out. For days he had lived inside a fog of disbelief, clinging to the official explanation that her passing was a tragic accident. An unfortunate misstep, a cruel twist of fate. He needed it to be an accident. Accidents were random. Accidents were survivable, at least in memory. Murder, however, was intentional. Murder implied choice. And if there had been choice, then someone he trusted had chosen to destroy everything. Electra stood a few feet away, her posture unyielding despite the tremor in her hands. She had always been the moral center of their tangled dynamic, guided by instinct and an unshakable belief that truth, however painful, was preferable to comfortable lies. Yet even she had not anticipated how far that conviction would be tested. Dylan, leaning against the far wall, tried to appear composed, but the mask he wore was cracking. There was a sharpness in his eyes, something restless and hunted, that betrayed the storm inside him. The argument erupted with the force of a dam breaking. Words collided, accusations ricocheted off marble and glass. Will demanded answers he wasn't sure he wanted. Electra questioned inconsistencies in Dylan's account of that night, small details that had never quite aligned. Dylan countered with indignation, insisting that grief had distorted their perceptions. His voice rose, then sharpened, then trembled in ways he couldn't quite control. Beneath the anger was fear, but it hid well behind pride. In the chaos of movement and raised voices, Electra's hand brushed against Dylan's phone, which had been placed carelessly on a nearby console table. The device slipped, striking the polished floor with a sharp, echoing crack. The screen lit up as it fell, responding to the sudden impact. For a split second, no one moved. Then Electra bent to retrieve it, her heart pounding more from instinct than curiosity. She intended only to return it, to continue the confrontation without interruption. But the screen remained illuminated, and something caught her eye. An application flickered open, one she did not recognize. A folder icon, unmarked, nested within layers of encrypted directories. It was the kind of digital secrecy that did not belong to ordinary conversations. A tension, subtle yet electric, rippled through her spine. She glanced up at Dylan. His face had drained of color. "Don't," he said, not loudly but with a raw urgency that felt like confession before the fact. That single word was enough. Electra's thumb hovered, then pressed. The hidden folder opened to reveal a single video file. No title, no timestamp, just a blank thumbnail that concealed whatever truth lay beneath. The room seemed to contract around them as she tapped the screen. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the footage began to play. The image was grainy, taken from a distance, perhaps recorded in secret. The angle suggested deliberate concealment. It showed a stretch of dimly lit roadway, the same road where Luna had died. The headlights of passing cars blurred into streaks of white and red. The timestamp in the corner confirmed the date. There she was, Luna, alive, walking along the edge of the street, unaware of what was coming. Will felt the air leave his lungs. He leaned forward, as if proximity could alter what he was seeing. The video continued. A figure emerged from the shadows. Dylan. There was no mistaking him, the posture, the jacket, the familiar silhouette. He approached Luna not with hesitation, but with intent. They appeared to exchange words, though the audio was too faint to capture them clearly. Then, in one abrupt, chilling motion, Dylan shoved her. Luna stumbled forward into the path of an oncoming car. The vehicle swerved too late. The screen filled with chaos. Screeching brakes, blurred movement, the violent collapse of a human body against unforgiving asphalt. Then darkness. The video ended. Silence descended with suffocating weight. Will staggered back as though struck. His mind rebelled against the evidence, scrambling to reinterpret what he had seen. Perhaps the angle was misleading. Perhaps it was edited. Perhaps grief had distorted his perception. But the truth was there, unyielding and merciless. Dylan had not merely been present that night. He had orchestrated it. The push had not been panic or accident. It had been deliberate. Something inside Will broke. He had defended Dylan. He had silenced doubts, dismissed suspicions, argued fiercely against anyone who dared imply wrongdoing. He had anchored his own grief to the belief that tragedy was impersonal. Now that anchor dissolved, leaving him adrift in a sea of betrayal. The realization that he had protected a murderer, welcomed him into his home, trusted him with confidences, was almost more unbearable than Luna's death itself. Electra's shock manifested differently. Her horror sharpened into clarity. The trembling in her hands steadied, replaced by a fierce, focused resolve. There was no room for denial in her mind. The footage was explicit, the intention unmistakable. She looked at Dylan not with confusion, but with recognition, of guilt, of exposure, of a mask stripped away. Dylan's composure collapsed entirely. Panic overtook him in visible waves. His breathing became erratic, sweat beaded along his temples. He searched their faces for mercy, for misunderstanding, for anything that could unravel the evidence before him. Words formed on his lips, fragments of excuses, half-finished rationalizations, but none were strong enough to combat the undeniable truth captured on screen. Electra acted first. She tightened her grip on the phone and stepped back, distancing herself from Dylan as if he were physically contagious. Her thumb hovered over the emergency call icon. This was no longer a matter of personal betrayal. It was criminal. It was justice. Dylan lunged forward, instinct overriding reason, but will moved between them. The motion was not calculated, it was reflex. For the first time that night, Will's grief transformed into something fierce and protective. Not of Dylan, but of the truth. He stared at Dylan with an expression that held nothing of the friendship they once shared. Only devastation. You planned it, Will whispered, though the words felt torn from him rather than spoken. You planned her death. Dylan's eyes flickered with something dangerously close to madness. Desperation clawed at him, stripping away whatever facade he had constructed. The narrative he had rehearsed for weeks, perhaps months, had disintegrated in seconds. There was no denying the footage. No plausible reinterpretation, only exposure. Electra pressed the call button. The dial tone seemed impossibly loud in the cavernous room. Dylan recoiled as though the sound itself were a weapon. In that instant, he understood what had been lost, not just freedom, but identity. He had lived under the fragile illusion that he could compartmentalize his actions. That the night Luna died could remain sealed away in darkness. But secrets have gravity. They pull toward revelation. And now, under the sterile glow of chandeliers, his secret stood illuminated beyond concealment. He turned and ran. The heavy doors of the estate swung open as he burst into the night. The echo of his footsteps fading across the stone terrace. The ocean wind swallowed him, carrying away the last remnants of denial. He did not look back. Inside, the mansion felt irreparably altered. The grandeur remained, but it seemed hollow, like a stage set after the curtain has fallen. Will sank into a chair, his body unable to sustain the weight of what he had learned. The video replayed in his mind with merciless clarity. Luna's final moments were no longer abstract tragedy, they were deliberate cruelty. And the person responsible had stood beside him, accepted his trust, absorbed his loyalty. Electra ended the call and lowered the phone slowly. The resolve that had propelled her now gave way to trembling grief. She had done what was right, yet righteousness offered no comfort. The truth, once uncovered, does not mend, it severs. They stood in the aftermath together, united not by shared love but by shared devastation. The future stretched before them uncertain and scarred. Dylan's flight would ignite investigation, pursuit, public scrutiny. The Spencer name would once again be dragged through headlines and speculation. But none of that mattered in comparison to the private wreckage. Will closed his eyes and saw Luna as she had been before that night, laughing, luminous, alive. He realized that his grief would now carry an additional burden. The knowledge that her death had not been senseless chaos, but intentional harm. There is a particular cruelty in that awareness. It robs memory of innocence. Electra moved closer, though neither spoke. Words felt inadequate against the magnitude of betrayal. They were haunted not only by what the video revealed, but by what it implied. That evil can reside quietly within proximity. Masked by charm, by familiarity, by shared history. Outside, sirens began to wail faintly in the distance. Justice would follow its course. Dylan would be hunted, questioned, judged. The law would address the crime. But no legal resolution could restore what had been lost. Trust, once shattered, leaves splinters embedded deep within the heart. The Spencer estate would stand, immaculate and imposing, as it always had. Yet for Will and Electra, it would never feel the same. Beneath its polished surfaces lingered the echo of a video that rewrote everything they thought. They knew. The night had transformed them irrevocably. Grief had turned into horror. Love had turned into betrayal. And the truth, once hidden in a secret folder, now lived permanently in memory. Unerasable, unforgiving, And devastatingly clear, the sirens grew louder, slicing through the ocean wind like a warning that no one inside the Spencer estate could escape. Yet even before the authorities arrived, something irreversible had already taken place. The law would chase Dylan across city lines, across headlines, across whatever desperate path he chose in his flight. But inside that mansion, justice had already begun its quiet, merciless work. It had dismantled illusion. It had exposed loyalty as blindness. It had carved a permanent fracture through the lives of Will and Electra. Will remained seated long after Dylan disappeared into the night. The world around him felt distorted, as if gravity itself had shifted. Every memory he shared with Dylan now reassembled itself under a harsher light. Conversations replayed in his mind with altered meaning. Small pauses, odd silences, subtle deflections, details he once dismissed as stress or grief, now formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. He realized that he had not merely trusted Dylan, he had defended him with ferocity. He had silenced those who questioned him. He had allowed himself to believe that loyalty required denial. That realization cut deeper than the betrayal itself. Electra stood near the window, watching the flashing red and blue lights begin to paint the estate's walls in fractured color. She felt both hollow and intensely alive at the same time. Adrenaline still pulsed through her veins. Yet beneath it was a tremor of grief so profound she could barely steady her breathing. She had suspected something was wrong. Her instincts had whispered that the accident narrative did not sit right. But suspicion is not proof. And proof, once uncovered, carries a weight suspicion never does. She turned back toward Will, studying the devastation etched across his face. This was not only about Luna's death. This was about identity, about how easily love can be weaponized, about how trust, when misplaced, becomes complicity without intention. She wanted to comfort him, but comfort felt almost obscene in the face of what they had witnessed. When the police finally entered the estate, their presence felt procedural, distant, almost unreal. Officers took statements. They asked for the phone. They requested a copy of the video. Electra handed it over with steady hands, though her heart pounded violently in her chest. Will spoke slowly, his voice devoid of the authority that once defined him. He described the confrontation, the discovery, Dylan's reaction. Each sentence felt like another confirmation that the life he thought he knew had been constructed. A top deception. The officers promised a manhunt would begin immediately. Dylan's name would be circulated. His photograph distributed. Roadblocks considered. There was talk of digital tracking, financial tracing, airport alerts. The machinery of justice was efficient, relentless. But as they left, the mansion returned to its vast, echoing silence. Night deepened. Will rose eventually and walked toward the staircase, then stopped halfway up. The house felt unfamiliar, as though walls had shifted in his absence. Luna's laughter had once echoed through these halls. Now the air seemed to carry only the phantom sound of that video. The screech of tires. The blur of impact. He pressed his hand against the banister, steadying himself against a wave of nausea. I protected him, he said quietly, more to himself than to Electra. I stood between him and doubt. Electra did not rush to contradict him. She understood the guilt forming in his chest. But she also understood its injustice. Dylan's crime was his own. Manipulation thrives on trust, that is its most effective camouflage. Will had not known. And yet knowing that fact did not ease the ache of self-reproach. Trust isn't a crime, she finally said, her voice low but firm. What he did is. Will looked at her, eyes red but sharp. Luna is gone because he decided she should be. There was no answer to that. In another part of the city, Dylan drove recklessly along darkened highways. The glow of streetlights flashing across his windshield like accusations. His mind raced faster than the car itself. The image of the video playing, of his own deliberate shove, looped mercilessly in his thoughts. He had believed the footage lost. He had believed he had erased every trace. The recording had been insurance once. Something he kept as leverage. Perhaps even as a reminder of control. But control is an illusion when conscience begins to fracture. He told himself he had reasons. That Luna had threatened something. That her existence complicated a future he believed he deserved. That circumstances had forced his hand. Rationalizations rose and collapsed in quick succession. Beneath them all lay a simpler truth he refused to articulate: he had chosen violence. He had chosen to end a life. Panic sharpened his focus. He needed distance. He needed anonymity. He needed time to think. Yet every passing mile only intensified the certainty that there was nowhere far enough to outrun. What had been exposed? The video existed now beyond his possession. It would be analyzed, duplicated, dissected. His face, his movement, his intent, frozen forever in digital evidence. Back at the estate, Will and Electra sat opposite each other in the dimly lit living room. Exhaustion had settled heavily between them. Their relationship, once strained by grief, now faced a new test. How to rebuild trust in a world that had just proven how easily trust can be corrupted. Electra broke the silence first. "We have to prepare," she said. "This won't stay private." Will nodded slowly. He understood what she meant. The Spencer name carried visibility. Scandal would follow swiftly. Reporters would speculate. Commentators would dissect motives. Luna's death would be reclassified in public consciousness from tragedy to homicide. And with that shift would come scrutiny. "I don't care about the press," Will said. "I care that I didn't see it." That confession revealed the core of his torment. It was not merely that Dylan had deceived him. It was that he now questioned his own perception. How many warning signs had he overlooked? How many times had loyalty overridden intuition? Electra leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "You didn't see it because you loved him like a brother. That's not blindness. That's humanity." Her words were sincere, yet neither of them felt absolved. The following days unfolded with ruthless speed. News outlets confirmed that Luna's death was under criminal investigation. Anonymous sources referenced newly uncovered evidence. Dylan's image circulated across networks. The narrative shifted from sympathy to outrage. The public demanded answers. Will withdrew from public appearances. He refused interviews. He issued only a brief statement expressing cooperation with authorities and grief for Luna. Behind closed doors, however, he battled insomnia and relentless memory. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the push. The deliberate motion. The moment choice overrode conscience. Electra immersed herself in coordination with investigators. She provided detailed accounts. She insisted on transparency. Her upright nature would not allow retreat into silence. Yet even as she acted with resolve, she carried a quiet tremor of fear. Fear not of Dylan's arrest, but of what betrayal does to the soul. It leaves residue. It reshapes how you evaluate the people closest to you. Meanwhile, Dylan's flight grew more desperate. He abandoned his vehicle in a coastal town and boarded a bus under a false name. He shaved his beard. He changed clothes. Each action felt like survival, yet also like disintegration. He was erasing himself piece by piece. The weight of his crime no longer felt distant or theoretical. It pressed against his chest with suffocating insistence. Alone in a motel room days later, he replayed the events in his mind. Not the video, but the night itself. Luna's expression before he pushed her. The hesitation he almost felt. The fraction of a second in which he could have chosen differently. That sliver of possibility haunted him more than the act itself. Because it proved he had known. Back at the estate, Will visited the site where Luna had died. The road looked ordinary in daylight. Traffic flowed without awareness of what had occurred there. He stood at the edge of the pavement, imagining her final steps. Grief no longer felt abstract. It felt anchored to asphalt and impact. Electra joined him, and for a long moment they stood in silence. The wind moved softly through nearby trees. Life continued around them, indifferent and relentless. "He took her choice," Will said finally. "He decided her story ended there." Electra nodded. "And now he'll have to face the consequences of that decision." Justice would not restore Luna. It would not mend the fracture in Will's trust or erase the horror of that footage. But it would draw a line, a necessary boundary between grief and impunity. Weeks later, authorities would capture Dylan in a neighboring state after a tip from a motel clerk who recognized his face from the news. His arrest would be swift, public, definitive. The footage would serve as undeniable evidence. The trial would follow, heavy with testimony and digital replay. But on that first night, in the immediate aftermath of revelation, none of that was certain. Only one truth was clear: the lives of everyone inside the Spencer estate had changed irrevocably. Will and Electra returned home from the roadside memorial long after dusk. The mansion felt quieter than ever. Yet within that quiet was something different now, not illusion, not denial, but clarity. Painful clarity. Trust would have to be rebuilt slowly, cautiously. Love would have to learn how to exist without naivety. And grief would remain, a permanent companion shaped by both loss and betrayal. The video had exposed a murderer. But it had also exposed the fragile architecture of human faith in one another. And in the ruins of that architecture, Will and Electra would have to decide whether they could construct something stronger. Or whether the memory of that single, deliberate shove would forever cast its shadow over every future they attempted to claim.